Building your first cutting board has got to be one of the biggest rites of passage as a woodworker, but it can actually be pretty tough to build a nice looking cutting board depending on the tools you have at your disposal. So in this video, I'm going to build 3 levels of cutting boards: beginner, intermediate, and pro, and this pro board just about broke me. Why is it loose? Dude, what do I do? The first cutting board design, my beginner board, is I guess more of a charcuterie board, but the nice thing about building these kinds of boards is their design is completely open-ended. Charcuterie boards can be any shape you want, and they're usually just made from a chunk of wood, so depending on the size of your finished board, you don't even need to do any glue-ups. When I was messing around with the shape I wanted for my charcuterie board, I ended up with something similar to a guitar body, so I decided to lean into that and modeled my board after a Fender Jazzmaster or Jaguar. And I could have definitely just printed off a paper template, but I figured I'd try cutting the template from a piece of acrylic with my new laser cutter. And you can also purchase these charcuterie board templates all over the place online if you don't feel like making one for yourself. Once I had my template, I scrounged around my lumber rack until I found the perfect offcut from a walnut slab. Then I could roughly cut the piece to size before milling. This piece was a little too thick for a jigsaw, so I used my bandsaw here, but unfortunately I ran into some issues. So I'm not really sure what happened here, but my giant 1-inch wide resaw blade decided to snap in half while making this cut, and needless to say, it scared the crap out of me. Good God, that was terrifying. Wasn't even at the weld. That's the weld where you would expect it to break. Thankfully, I was clear of the blade when it happened, and after taking a minute to settle down, I installed a new blade and continued the rough cutting. Once the piece was cut to rough size, I got it flattened using my jointer and planer. And you could just buy pre-milled material and skip this step if you don't have access to these tools. I planed the piece down to about 1.25 inches thick and then headed to the router table to flush up the blank with my template. I attached the template to the blank with some double-sided tape and then fired up the router, which had a spiral flush trim bit installed. And I definitely could have gotten a little closer to my line when rough cutting the blank, but even with all this material, this bit had no trouble chewing through this walnut. I worked my way around the entire template, and once the blank was flush trimmed, I popped off the template and moved to the oscillating belt sander to clean up the edges. I had one section where a small chunk broke off, so I needed to rework the curve in that area a bit, but otherwise this was pretty quick work. I also went ahead and drilled a hole in the handle at the drill press, and I'm honestly not sure why, but it seems like every charcuterie board has a hole in the handle, so I went with it even though I don't really see myself hanging this on my wall. Next, I got to work hand sanding the inside of some of those tighter curves, and I used a combination of these little rubber contour sanding grips and sandpaper wrapped around a dowel to clean up these areas. Once I had the edges cleaned up, I went ahead and added an edge profile, and keeping with the Jazzmaster theme, I went with a pretty heavy roundover. I also tried adding the same roundover to the inside edge of the hole I drilled, but wasn't really a fan of the look, so I went with a chamfer on that edge on the front of the board. After adding the roundover, I had lots more sanding work ahead of me, and I did kind of regret making this board a shape which was extremely awkward to sand. Once the board was sanded up to 180 grit, I raised the grain by spraying it down with water. Woo! Nice. And this is especially important with cutting boards considering they're going to be washed regularly. And if you don't pop the grain before finishing, the board will end up feeling rough and fuzzy after its first washing. I also decided to add my logo and the date on the back of the board with my laser cutter, and I really think these excel at this kind of branding work. It's super quick and you get perfect results every time, unlike branding irons, which can be kind of finicky. After branding, I sanded the board with 320 grit to knock down the fuzzies from raising the grain. Then it was time to add some finish. I had a few sample bottles of this walrus oil, cutting board oil on hand, and figured I'd give it a shot, and this stuff worked great. I think it left a much nicer sheen than pure mineral oil, and I'm guessing it'll be a little more durable than mineral oil as well. I applied a heavy coat and then left the finish to continue to absorb overnight before coming back and wiping off the excess the next day. Man, that looks nice. And with that, my beginner charcuterie board was done, and I think this turned out great. This is a perfect use case for those larger offcuts you might have hanging around, and I think these boards make great gifts seeing as the holiday season is just around the corner. So my second cutting board design, the intermediate board, is the classic long grain cutting board, and this is another great way to use up some scraps. My scrap pile was long overdue for a culling, so I took this as an opportunity to thin the herd, putting aside a pile for trash, a pile for this cutting board, and a pile to keep for other projects. After getting my scraps together, I decided on a good length for the board based on the scraps I had, and this board ended up around 20 inches long. Once the scraps were cut to length, I ripped all of the strips to 1.5 inches wide, so I would have a consistent height for all of the pieces. And this step is critical if you don't have a planer, since making sure all of your pieces are the same dimension will mean you can easily skip the planing process as long as you're careful during the glue up. Most of these boards have been hanging around my shop for at least 5 years at this point, so I ran the strips through the planer just to clean up the glue faces, but this step isn't really necessary if you're buying pre-milled lumber. I ended up with 5 different wood species on this board, including maple, purple heart, cherry, walnut, and some very thin strips of what I think was babinga. I spent a few minutes arranging them in an aesthetically pleasing layout, then I could get the board glued up. My go-to glue for cutting boards is Titebond 3 since it's food safe and waterproof, and that's what I went with here. So as I mentioned before, the glue up is absolutely critical if you don't have a planer because you want to try your best to keep all of the pieces flat while clamping to minimize sanding later. And you can do this with clamping cauls, or in my case, I use these small panel clamps, which make these kinds of cutting board glue ups a breeze.
1 hour later.
I left the cutting board in the clamps for about an hour, then removed the clamps and scraped off the excess glue before it had a chance to fully harden. After the glue dried, I could get the board cleaned up, and there are a few ways of doing this. One great tool for removing glue squeeze out and cleaning up the seams between pieces is a card scraper. And card scrapers leave you with an amazing surface finish and can really cut back on the time you spend sanding. If you don't have a card scraper, a random orbit sander will definitely work, and as you can see, after only a few minutes of sanding with 80 grit and then a quick card scraping, this board was looking great even without a planer. After the initial sanding, I got the board trimmed to final length using my crosscut sled, and I made sure to install a blade designed for crosscutting to ensure I got the cleanest cut. Next, it was time for a first for me, cutting a juice groove. And as crazy as it might sound, I don't think I've ever cut a juice groove in my decade of woodworking, but that was all about to change. So I picked up this juice groove bit, which I'll link to in the video description, and this thing worked really well and even broke the edges of the juice groove during the routing process. Before cutting the groove, I needed to whip up a quick jig. And there are all kinds of very complicated juice groove jig designs out there, but I decided to keep it simple, and in my case, my jig was just a piece of plywood which was cut to be set in 3 inches from each edge of the board. I figured out this dimension by measuring the distance the inside of my router base was from the edge of the cutting board, with the bit centered about 1 inch from the edge of the board. I attached the plywood to the cutting board using more double-sided tape, set my bit height to about 1/8 of an inch, and then I could get to routing. And this was a pretty simple process. I just needed to make sure the router base stayed in contact with the plywood at all times. I definitely didn't love that there was nothing keeping the router on course, and it would be very easy to mess up your groove if you weren't careful, but overall this was pretty straightforward. I cut the groove in 3 passes and thankfully ended up with a very nice looking groove. Next, I wanted to add a handle cutout to the ends of the board, and I used a large 1.25" bowl bit for this. And the process of adding these handle cutouts was pretty simple. I just set up a stop block on each side of the bit, and then routed the handle into each end of the board. And I made the cut in 3 passes, raising the bit about 1/4 of an inch between each pass. One thing you've probably already noticed is that routing the juice groove using the method I showed gives the corners of the groove a pretty significant radius, about 3 inches in this case. And I thought the board looked a little funky with those square corners, and thankfully it was easy enough to add a matching radius with the help of a radius jig and my flush trim bit. And just like with the charcuterie board, I further refined the corners using the oscillating belt sander. Once that was done, it was time for yet another sanding montage, and the sanding process here was a little more complicated with that juice groove. Thankfully, I picked up this awesome juice groove scraper from DFM Toolworks recently, And this thing was amazing at cleaning up those grooves. I also did a little laser engraving on the back of this board, which is a birthday present for my buddy Josh. And after the laser did its thing, I applied more of that walrus oil, which really brought this board to life. Once the oil had a chance to soak in overnight, I buffed off the excess, then finished the board by adding a few rubber feet. The last board I wanted to build, my pro level board, is one I've had on my to build list for years, and that's an in-grain cutting board with an inlay cut on the CNC. And I, of course, decided to take it up a notch and make the inlay cover the entire surface of the board, meaning everything had to be dialed in perfectly, but what could go wrong, right?
Why is it loose? Dude, what do I do?
So building this board started just like the long grain board, ripping a bunch of maple and walnut into strips, planing the glue faces, and then gluing them up. And I actually started this board before the long grain board and made sure to add some builder's paper on my workbench to keep it from getting covered in glue. I knew I'd be running these boards through the planer after gluing, so I wasn't as concerned with keeping everything perfectly flat during the glue up. I just wanted to get these boards clamped up as quickly as possible. I made 2 of the maple blanks, which would be the base of the finished boards, just in case something went wrong. And in retrospect, I am so glad I did this because the CNC process ended up being really tricky. Just like with the other long grain board, I let the glue dry for a few hours and scraped off the excess, but this time I ran them through my planer to flatten them. After planing, I moved to the table saw to cross-cut the long grain boards into strips, but before cutting, I did some quick math to work out how wide I should rip the strips to end up with in-grain boards the size I wanted. The walnut boards only needed to be around 3/4 of an inch thick since they'd be used for the inlay, but the maple boards needed to be about 1 5/8 inches thick. As I cut, I kept the strips oriented just like they were before ripping, and this would allow me to easily arrange them in a pattern before the next glue up. I finished off the cuts without the crosscut sled, and once all the strips were crosscut, I could get them arranged in the clamps. I rotated each strip 90 degrees so the in-grain surface was facing up, then I flipped every other strip to give me that classic in-grain cutting board pattern. On the walnut boards, I staggered every other strip during the glue up, which creates that running bond pattern, and I used those panel clamps again to help keep the board nice and flat during the glue up. I repeated the process for the 2 maple boards and ended up with 4 boards in total, 2 of the maple base boards and 2 of the walnut inlay boards. I once again removed the excess glue after a few hours, then I ran the boards through my drum sander to clean them up. And I've used a planer to do this in the past, which is a hotly debated topic in the woodworking world, but I didn't want to risk it with these thinner boards. That said, this particular drum sander continues to be the bane of my existence, and I feel like I'm constantly dealing with the workpiece slipping on the conveyor, which leads to the drum gouging the surface of the piece. And if you have any tips, I would love to hear them. Anyway, after cleaning up the boards on the drum sander, it was time to get to cutting on the CNC, and as you can probably imagine, I was pretty nervous. Not only had I already sunk hours of work into making these boards, I was also working with these very small, fragile bits, and to make things worse, I didn't have any backup bits on hand in case one broke. I had a pretty tight deadline on this project though, so it was time to get started, and the first step was getting the first maple board attached to my spoil board. After mounting, I marked the center of the board, which was the reference point which I zeroed the CNC off of on all of these boards. Next, I could get my first bit installed, a 3/16 inch spiral upcut bit, and I zeroed the bit's Z height using the touch plate, then zeroed the X and Y axes by centering the bit on my center mark. And once all that was done, it was time to make the first cut.
All right, this is the moment of truth. I will admit I am very nervous right now. It's my first time doing this exact kind of thing, but I think I double and triple checked all of my files and bits and all of that stuff, and so ready to go ahead and start the first pass with this 3/16 of an inch end mill, and this is going to clear out the bulk of the material, and then after this is done, I'll come back with the V-bit to finish up the carve.
So thankfully this clearance pass went really smoothly and that spiral upcut bit cut into that ingrain extremely cleanly. Once it was done, I swapped over to the bit that really makes this whole process work, this tapered ball nose bit. This bit is tapered at 10 degrees, meaning it cuts the walls of the inlay at a 5-degree angle. And this slight angle allows for a small amount of slop in the fit between the pocket and the inlay. And since the inlay is also cut with this bit, the inlay is essentially wedged into the pocket. If I were to try and do this same kind of inlay with a straight bit, I would inevitably end up with some kind of interference due to these square walls, which is exactly what happened the last time I tried to do this over 8 years ago. So I made a video for the Make Magazine YouTube channel featuring a project similar to this, and unfortunately the inlay completely failed because of that interference since I wasn't using one of these tapered bits. I wasn't going to let that happen again, and thankfully the tapered ball nose bit seemed to be working great. Also, because this is a spiral upcut bit, the walls of the pocket were incredibly clean even though they're ingrain. The cutting board did end up warping slightly during the 2-hour carving process, I think due to all that fresh ingrain being exposed during the milling process, and I made sure to use some hot glue to reattach the corners before cutting the juice groove, and finally cutting the board to size. I used a 1/2-inch spiral upcut bit to cut the juice groove and also do the perimeter cut, and it seems like upcut is definitely the way to go when working with ingrain like this. And with that done, the base board with the pocket was looking good, so it was time to mill the inlay, or plug as it's called when working with these kinds of V-carve inlays. This process was very similar. I used double stick tape to attach the board, then ran the initial clearance pass with a 3/16" bit before swapping to the tapered ball nose bit to finish up the cut. As you can probably see though, this board warped much worse than the maple board, I think because it was so thin, and I ended up adding some screws to hold it down more securely. And if I were to set up my CNC to do this kind of work more frequently, I would definitely set up some better clamping fixtures for holding these boards flat to the spoil board. And as you might have noticed, I ran all of these cuts without dust collection just so you could see what exactly was happening a little more easily, but this definitely made for more cleanup work after the cut. I was super excited with how everything was looking, and all that was left to do before the test fit was to remove the excess material around the edges of the inlay, and I did this at the bandsaw. I also cleaned out any little bits of sawdust or fuzzies since any interference can cause issues, and I added some painter's tape to keep glue out of the juice groove. Then it was time for the test fit.
Yes! Oh, what a relief. Oh no, why is it loose? Why is it loose?
So much to my dismay, the inlay was extremely loose in the pocket. My nightmare had become reality, and I had wasted days of time in the shop at this point.
Why is it loose? Dude, what do I do?
So after a little sulking, I did some research, and as it turns out, the source of my problem was that tapered ball nose bit. So the software I use to design these kinds of CNC projects is called Vectric Aspire. And Vectric released an awesome new V-carve inlay toolpath option in their software, but unfortunately, the software expects you to use standard V-bits, not tapered ball nose bits. The pockets created when using a ball nose bit end up slightly too big, and the inlay ends up slightly too small. And that error is compounded when you combine the two, and as you already saw, you end up with a very loose inlay. So there are a handful of videos on this topic out there, and the consensus is you basically just have to play around with the variables in the software to account for the ball nose bit, and so I started doing some test cuts to dial everything in. This process ended up taking an entire day of my time, partially because I immediately broke my 3/16" bit
Stop!
and had to modify my design to work with a 1/4" bit. The trick here is you want the inlay to go into the pocket deep enough so it has a good solid fit, but not so deep that it bottoms out before closing up the gaps between the pocket and the inlay. And as it turns out, this is a very fine balance, but after doing 5 test cuts and glue ups, I got my Goldilocks fit and felt like I was ready to try again on the second set of boards I had made. I wasn't taking any chances on the boards warping this time, so I used an excessive amount of painter's tape and CA glue to hold down the first board. Thankfully, the overkill worked and the board didn't warp at all during the milling process, and I was also a little more comfortable with pushing my feeds and speeds since I'd had so much practice using these bits at this point, and the carves went much more quickly. The walnut board was also looking really good, and now it was time for the real moment of truth, the test fit.
Okay, take 2. Please fit nicely. Yes. That
Seems like it is good. Oh yeah. See, it's like wedged in there. Oh, that is such a relief. Oh my gosh. Okay, let's glue this stupid thing up. Thankfully, the fit was perfect, so I can move on to the glue up, which is another tricky part of these kinds of CNC inlays. So the people who make these kinds of boards day in and day out typically use some kind of hydraulic press, but I don't have one of those. Instead, I pulled out basically every heavy-duty clamp I had on hand and clamped the ever-loving crap out of this thing. And after going overboard with the clamps, I left the board to dry over the weekend. Monday could not come soon enough, and as soon as I arrived at the shop Monday morning, I pulled off the clamp and cut off the excess walnut, and I was so relieved to see the inlay had turned out absolutely perfectly. I ran the board through the drum sander and hit it with 80 grit on my random orbit sander, then I could really admire how the board was looking. Man, looks sick. Freaking perfectly tight. No gaps at all. That's so cool. I went ahead and chamfered the edges of the board, and one tip, I ended up with a lot less tear out when I ran the router in the wrong direction, making a climb cut. Next was lots and lots of sanding, and as you'll know if you've ever built an in-grain cutting board, it is really tough to get these all cleaned up. I popped the grain a few times along the way and added my stamp before finally adding some finish, and this was really when I could relax, confident in the fact that this project was officially a success. Just like with the other boards, once the finish soaked in overnight, I buffed off the excess, then added a few rubber feet to wrap up the board. So I'll have links to all the tools I used in this video in the video description below. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And if you're a newer woodworker trying to improve your skills, check out my beginner course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. Thanks again for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.